At 4 a.m., a fireball lit up the sky over a Russian city more than 1,300 kilometers from Ukraine's border. Russian officials called it a gas leak. But the building that exploded wasn't a gas station. It was one of the only factories on Earth that builds the engines for Russia's most advanced nuclear missiles. And for 80 years, this place was untouchable, too deep, too far, too protected to ever be hit, until June 10th, when something flew across an entire country's airspace and proved that theory wrong. Nobody knows what it was. Nobody knows how far it can really go, and that uncertainty alone has just changed how Russia has to defend itself, forever. If you want to understand exactly what happened, why this target was chosen, and what it means for the next phase of this war, stay with me, because by the end of this video you'll know something almost nobody else watching the news today does. And if that sounds like something you need to see, hit subscribe right now before we get into it, because once you see what's coming, you're not going to want to miss what we cover next. So smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to see it, and drop a comment telling me what you think really happened. So let's go back to the beginning, because every detail here matters. Within minutes of the explosion, local Telegram channels were posting videos of a massive fireball rising over an industrial complex on the edge of the city of Votkinsk, in the Udmurt Republic. By sunrise, Russian state media had a story ready. They called it a technical incident. Some outlets said it was a transformer fire. One regional account said it was a gas pipeline rupture, completely unrelated to any military activity. Routine. Nothing to see. Just an unfortunate accident at an industrial facility. Okay? Now here's the problem. The facility that caught fire that morning was the Votkinsk mechanical plant. And if that name doesn't mean anything to you yet, it will by the end of this video, because this is not some random factory. This is one of only a handful of facilities on the entire planet that builds the solid fuel motors for Russia's most advanced strategic missile systems, the Yas intercontinental ballistic missile and the Bulava submarine-launched missile, the backbone of Russia's nuclear modernization program for the last 2 decades. And while Russian officials were telling their own population that this was a gas line, something else was happening at almost the exact same hour. Senior figures in the Russian defense establishment were on record, on the same week, repeating a line they have repeated constantly throughout this war. They have said, over and over, that Ukraine simply does not have the technical capability to strike deep into Russian territory without missiles supplied by the West, and that any deep strike claims are either fabricated or involve repurposed NATO hardware. That was the official position. Ukraine cannot reach us here. We are too far away. Geography protects us. And on the same week that position was being repeated, something flew 1,300 kilometers across Russian airspace, past multiple layers of air defense, and detonated inside one of the most sensitive strategic production facilities in the country. Two things cannot both be true. Either Russia's deep interior is secure or it is not. And on June 10th, 2026, we got our answer. Now here's the thing. Almost everything you're going to read about this in the next few days is going to focus on the wrong question. The headlines are going to ask, what missile was this? Did NATO secretly supply it? Is this a British Storm Shadow, an American ATACMS, a German Taurus finally approved after years of debate? That is the question every major outlet is going to chase, because that question fits the existing narrative. It fits the story that's been told since 2022, the story where Ukraine's capabilities are always downstream of a Western decision, where the real story is always what Washington or London or Berlin decided to authorize. And I want to tell you, that is the wrong question. It is the wrong question because it assumes the only thing that matters is who built the weapon. The right question, the question almost nobody is asking, is this. What happens to a country the size of Russia? A country whose entire strategic doctrine for the last 100 years has been built on the idea that its size is its shield when that shield stops working. So here's the plan for today. First, I want to walk you through something I'm going to call the sanctuary doctrine, because once you understand where it comes from and how deep it runs in Russian military thinking, you'll understand why Votkinsk matters so much more than any single factory should. Then I want to talk about the weapon itself. What we actually know about it, what we don't know, and why the not knowing is itself the story. Then I'm going to walk through why this specific target, out of thousands of possible targets across an entire continent-spanning country, was chosen. Then I'm going to give you the Steelman case, the strongest argument for why this strike doesn't actually matter much in the bigger picture, and then I'm going to show you why that argument, as strong as it sounds, misses the deeper shift. And finally, 3 things I want you to watch in the coming weeks. Because those 3 things will tell you whether what happened on June 10th was an isolated event or the opening move of something much bigger. Okay? Let's go. To understand the sanctuary doctrine, you have to go back to 1941, When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in the history of warfare took place almost in parallel with the fighting itself. Soviet planners began moving entire factories, not just equipment, entire factories, workers, families, machine tools, blueprints, everything, eastward, beyond the Volga, beyond the Urals, into Siberia and Central Asia, places German bombers could never reach. Within months, more than 1,500 major industrial enterprises had been relocated. And that decision, that single strategic choice made under existential pressure in 1941, shaped the geography of Soviet, and later Russian, military industry for the next 80 years. The logic was simple, and it was brutal in its simplicity. If your enemy cannot physically reach your production base is safe no matter what happens at the front. You can lose battles, you can lose territory, you can even lose entire armies. But as long as the factories keep running in the deep interior, you can rebuild and you can outlast. This is not just history. This is the foundational assumption underneath the entire dispersal pattern of Russian defense manufacturing today. Look at where Russia's most sensitive production facilities are located. Votkinsk in Udmurtia, Krasnoyarsk, home to the Krasmash plant that also produces components for the Bulava system. Arsenyev, near the Pacific coast, building advanced air defense systems. These locations were not chosen randomly. They are deep, they are dispersed, and for 80 years they have operated under one quiet, unspoken assumption that no adversary could ever physically deliver a weapon that far. That assumption is the sanctuary doctrine. It is not written down in any single document, but it is baked into every decision about where to build, what, how much to invest in air defense around interior cities versus border regions, and how much redundancy to build into any single production line. For 80 years, depth was defense. And on June 10, 2026, depth stopped being defense. Now let's talk about the weapon, because this is where it gets genuinely strange, and I want to walk through this carefully, because the not knowing here is doing a lot of work. In the days immediately after the strike, open source analysts, the people who spend their time poring over satellite imagery, flight tracking data, and debris photographs, started circulating images from the impact site. And what they noticed first was the crater pattern and the scale of the secondary explosions, which suggested a warhead significantly larger than anything Ukraine had previously used in its long-range strike campaign. For most of this war, Ukraine's deep strike program relied primarily on modified drones, slow propeller-driven aircraft with small warheads, optimized for range over payload, capable of reaching targets 800 to 1,000 kilometers away, sometimes a bit further, but always trading speed and destructive power for distance. Those strikes were real, and they were persistent, hitting oil refineries, fuel depots, and air bases deep inside Russia for years. But what hit Votkinsk did not match that profile. Analysts pointed to fragment patterns consistent with a jet-powered airframe, something that flew faster, lower, and with a far larger payload than the slow attritional drones that had become the signature of Ukraine's previous campaign. And here's where it gets interesting, because back in August of 2025, a Ukrainian defense manufacturer had publicly unveiled a new cruise missile, a jet-powered system with a claimed range of around 3,000 kilometers and a warhead reportedly over 1,000 kilograms, dramatically larger than anything in Ukraine's existing arsenal. At the time, that announcement was treated by most Western analysts the way these announcements often are, as aspirational, as a deterrent signal, as something that might exist on paper or in small numbers, but was unlikely to be operationally significant anytime soon. Ukraine's own officials, when asked about the strike on Votkinsk, gave almost nothing away. No confirmation of the platform used, no acknowledgement of which unit conducted it. Just a short statement thanking, in very general terms, those responsible for what they called a successful long-range operation against a facility involved in what they described as the production of weapons used against Ukrainian civilians. That's it. No missile name, no technical details. And that silence is not an accident. Think about what Ukraine gains by staying silent. If this was the missile unveiled back in 2025, finally proven operational, at a range that puts essentially the entire Russian Federation, including Moscow, including every major production facility east of the Urals that was previously considered untouchable, within reach, then the value of that information is enormous, and revealing it gives Russia something concrete to defend against. But if Ukraine stays silent, Russian air defense planners now have to assume the worst. They have to assume that everything, everywhere, all the time, is potentially in range. And that assumption is far more expensive to defend against than any single confirmed capability. easy, because defending against an unknown threat that could be anywhere means you can't concentrate your defenses. You have to spread them everywhere, and spreading air defense everywhere means it's effectively strong nowhere. That's the weapon nobody knew existed. Not in the sense that nobody had ever heard of it. Some open source analysts had been tracking rumors of this program for months, but in the sense that nobody, until June 10th, knew it actually worked at this range, against a target this significant, with this level of precision. Now let's talk about why Votkinsk specifically, because out of an entire country, out of thousands of industrial facilities, the choice of target tells you almost everything about the strategic thinking behind this operation. The Votkinsk mechanical plant doesn't just make missiles in some generic sense. It is one of the very few facilities in Russia capable of producing the solid-fuel rocket motors for the Yars mobile intercontinental ballistic missile system and the Bulava missile carried on Russia's newest ballistic missile submarines. These are not battlefield weapons. These are the literal hardware of Russia's nuclear deterrent modernization. The systems Moscow has spent the last 15 years investing in specifically because they are considered survivable, mobile, and central to maintaining strategic parity with the United States. Now, I want to be very precise here, because this distinction matters enormously. Striking this facility does not mean striking nuclear weapons themselves, and it does not mean Ukraine has somehow acquired the ability to threaten Russia's nuclear arsenal directly. That is not what happened. And it's important not to overstate this. What happened is something more subtle, but arguably more destabilizing in the long run. Ukraine demonstrated the ability to reach into the supply chain of Russia's strategic deterrent, the production infrastructure that sustains and modernizes it, using a conventional weapon built domestically, without requiring permission from Washington or any NATO capital. Think about what that means from inside the Kremlin. For decades, the entire logic of strategic stability between major powers has rested on a clean separation between the conventional war happening at the front and the strategic assets sitting safely in the deep rear. Conventional wars are things you can lose battles in. Strategic assets are the things that, no matter how badly the conventional war goes, remain untouchable, remain the final guarantee. When a facility that builds components for that final guarantee can be hit by a drone-like weapon launched from inside a war zone 1,000 miles away, the clean separation starts to blur. And once that separation blurs even slightly, every assumption built on top of it has to be re-examined. How much air defense protects strategic production facilities versus frontline positions? How much should those facilities be dispersed, hardened, relocated even further east, even deeper, at enormous cost and disruption? These are the questions Russian military planners are dealing with right now, and there are no cheap answers to any of them. Okay, now let me give you the Steelman case, because I think it's important, and because I don't want you to walk away from this thinking the war just fundamentally changed overnight, because that's probably not true either. Here's the strongest version of the argument that this strike, as dramatic as it looks, doesn't actually change very much. First, redundancy. Russia almost certainly does not rely on a single facility for these systems. The Krasmash plant in Krasnoyarsk also has involvement in Bulava-related production, and Russia's defense industry, while strained, has spent years adapting to sanctions and disruption. A single strike, even on a significant facility, is unlikely to halt production of strategic systems entirely. It more likely creates delays, reroutes orders, and forces some short-term improvisation. Second, scale. The Soviet Union survived the loss of entire industrial regions during the Second World War and still outproduced its enemies by the end of the conflict. Russia has weathered 3 years of sanctions, specifically targeting its defense industrial base, and has continued to produce missiles, drones, and artillery shells at rates that surprised many Western analysts. One factory fire, however symbolically loaded, is not the same as a systemic collapse. Third, and this is important, deterrence by retaliation doesn't require an undamaged production line. It requires existing stockpiles, and Russia's existing stockpile of deployed strategic systems is unaffected by damage to a production facility. The missiles already built, already deployed, already in silos and on submarines don't disappear because a factory caught fire. So the argument goes, yes, this is embarrassing, yes, it's a propaganda win for Ukraine, but in terms of actual military balance, in terms of what changes on the battlefield tomorrow, the honest answer is probably not much. And I think that argument is largely correct in the short term, but here's what it misses, and this is the part I really want you to sit with. The question was never whether this one strike changes the war tomorrow. The question is what this strike changes about how Russia has to think about defending itself for the next 10 years. Because here's the asymmetry that the Steelman argument doesn't account for. The weapon that hit Votkinsk, whatever it specifically was, almost certainly cost a small fraction, of the value of the facility it damaged and the production time that facility represents. Precision missile manufacturing involves specialized machine tools, many of them historically sourced from Western countries and now subject to export controls that make replacing replacement enormously difficult. It involves highly trained technical personnel whose skills took years to develop. It involves production lines calibrated to extremely tight tolerances for systems where failure is not an option. None of that comes back online in weeks. Even with redundancy at other facilities, redirecting production, retraining workflows, and absorbing the loss of specialized equipment takes months at minimum. And that's assuming nothing else gets hit in the meantime. Meanwhile, the cost to Ukraine of attempting another strike like this, even if the success rate is low, even if most attempts get intercepted, is comparatively tiny. This is the cost asymmetry that defines almost every part of this war. Cheap drones against expensive air defense interceptors, cheap loitering munitions against billion-dollar warships, and now, potentially, a relatively cheap long-range cruise missile against an irreplaceable strategic production facility. When that asymmetry exists, the defender cannot simply absorb individual losses and move on, because the defender is the one accumulating cost over time, while the attacker's cost per attempt stays roughly constant. And there's a second thing the Steelman misses, which is psychological, but psychological doesn't mean unimportant. For 80 years, the people who work in places like Votkinsk, the engineers, the technicians, the families who've lived in that closed industrial city for generations. Many of these cities are still technically closed cities, restricted access, built specifically because of what they produce. Those people went to work every single day with the unspoken understanding that the war, whatever war, would never come to them. That was the deal. You live in a remote, cold, restricted city far from any border, and in exchange, you are safe. That deal was broken on June 10th. And you cannot unbreak a deal like that with a press release calling it a gas line explosion, because everyone in that city saw the fireball, and everyone in that city now knows something they didn't know the day before. Now let's zoom out, because this isn't just a Russia-Ukraine story anymore. This is a story about what every major power on Earth quietly assumed about geography, and is now being forced to reconsider. For the United States, China, India, every country with a large landmass and a strategy built around interior depth as a form of protection, what happened at Votkinsk is a live demonstration that a mid-sized power, under sanctions, fighting a grinding conventional war, with a fraction of the defense budget of a great power, can develop and deploy a weapon that erases 1,000 miles of supposed safety. That is not a comfortable thought for any planner anywhere in the world, and I guarantee you it is being discussed in rooms far beyond Moscow and Kiev right now. For NATO specifically, this creates an awkward situation. On one hand, an indigenously produced Ukrainian deep strike capability is, in some ways, the easiest possible outcome from a political standpoint. It removes the constant debate about whether allowing Ukraine to use Western-supplied long-range weapons against targets inside Russia constitutes direct escalation by NATO countries. If Ukraine built it, NATO didn't authorize it. And the diplomatic deniability that comes with that is frankly useful for everyone in Brussels and Washington who has spent years trying to manage exactly this kind of escalation risk. On the other hand, an independent Ukrainian deep strike capability that NATO doesn't control is also an independent variable that NATO can't manage, which means NATO capitals are now in the position of having less control over the trajectory of this conflict's escalation, not more, at exactly the moment when everyone publicly says they want de-escalation. Now let me give you 3 things to watch in the coming weeks, because these 3 things will tell you whether June 10th was a one-time demonstration or the start of a sustained shift. First, watch the satellite imagery around Russia's other strategic production facilities, specifically Krasnoyarsk, Arseniev, and the missile-related facilities around Votkinsk itself. If you start seeing new air defense deployments, new radar installations, or visible construction of hardened shelters around facilities that previously had minimal protection because they were considered too deep to need it, that tells you Russian planners have concluded this was not a one-off and are reallocating resources that by definition have to come from somewhere else, likely from air defense coverage closer to the front lines, where Ukraine's other strike campaigns are most active. Second, watch the tempo. One successful strike could be a single prototype, painstakingly built, used once for maximum strategic and propaganda effect. A second strike on a different facility within weeks rather than months tells you this is now a production weapon, something Ukraine can build repeatedly, not a one-time demonstration piece. The gap between Strike 1 and Strike 2 is one of the most important pieces of information in this entire story, and it's something almost nobody is going to be tracking carefully, except the people whose job it is to track exactly this. Third, watch how Russian officials talk about Western components. One of the most predictable patterns in this war has been Russia's response to any new Ukrainian capability, which is to immediately search for and publicize any Western-made component found in the wreckage, a chip, a sensor, a guidance module, anything. Because finding a Western part allows Russia to reframe the story away from indigenous Ukrainian capability and back toward the familiar narrative of NATO involvement. If you see a sudden new round of sanctions specifically targeting categories of electronics or precision components that haven't been a major focus before, that tells you Russian intelligence believes they've identified something specific in this weapon's supply chain, and that identification is itself useful information about what this weapon actually is. Here's your homework. I want you to go find open-source satellite imagery analysis of the Votkinsk site from before and after June 10th. There are several independent analyst accounts that specialize in exactly this kind of geolocation work, and compare the footprint of the damaged buildings to publicly available diagrams of the facility's production halls. Then I want you to read about the 1941 Soviet industrial evacuation, just the basic outline of it, how many factories were moved, how far, and how quickly, because understanding just how deeply that experience shaped Soviet and Russian strategic culture will help you understand why this single strike resonates so far beyond its immediate physical damage. And then I want you to sit with this question, because I don't think anyone, including me, has a complete answer to it yet. For the entirety of modern history, the largest country on Earth has treated its size as its single greatest strategic asset, the thing that no enemy could ever overcome no matter how the war at the edges was going. If that asset, geographic depth, geographic safety, is no longer something you can take for granted, what does the largest country on Earth do instead? Does it spend the next decade and an enormous fraction of its national wealth trying to harden and defend a landmass that spans 11 time zones, an effectively impossible task? Or does it accept that depth is no longer a guarantee and shift toward a doctrine that assumes the interior is contestable, the way the front line has always been contestable? Because those are two completely different countries, with two completely different strategic postures. And the answer to that question, the real answer, not the press release answer, is being written right now, in the decisions being made this week, about where air defense batteries get moved, which facilities get hardened first, and which ones get left exposed, because there simply isn't enough to go around. I don't know which way this goes. I genuinely don't. But I know that on June 9th, Votkinsk was considered one of the safest places to build the most important weapons in the country. And on June 10th, it wasn't. And that gap between what was true on Tuesday and what was true on Wednesday is the entire story.